This is attorney Andy Marcantel and attorney Joey Hamby from the Attorneys for Freedom law firm. We also have a guest with us in the studio who we're very eager to introduce, the esteemed Dr. John Black. He's an expert. He's worked on many wonderful cases, and we've used him in some self-defense work, and we wanted to introduce him. Let's just go right to the introductions. Dr. Black, who are you? And this is going to sound like a philosophical question. Why are you here?
Yeah, so a nice softball philosophical question. We know how that's going to go, right? So let's just set the people up for that. So in short answer, if you would take a look at my curriculum vitae or anything else, I come from basically three disciplines. I started out in the military, special operations. I served my entire time for about 30 years in the special operations community. I was a trainer, all that kind of stuff, door kicker, all the way up to and including nation building, psychological operations, and whatever. After that, I also have about 23 plus years in policing. Again, started as patrol, worked all the way up to command ranks, was an instructor at the State Academy, hostage negotiation, mobile response teams, senior instructors, internal affairs, you name it, probably did it when it came to that. Finally, I also pursued academia. And so while I was in the military, I got my first master's degree, which is in counterterrorism. Not a lot of call of that in other areas, amazingly so. And so I went into the idea, what I kept noticing, and it's a real interesting question, is I don't care whether it was three people together, and in the case of, think about a lethal force decision-making, stuff you and I have talked about, two people together, why am I watching the same decision problems, the same way we think about it, occur whether it's two people or 1,500 people in Afghanistan? Because I'm watching the same thing. I didn't care about the culture. So I started studying it. My doctoral degree is actually in the world of business. I started out with business intelligence with visual information. But I also am an advanced force science specialist. I'm a forensic video analyst. And my postdoctoral master's is in psychology. And all that focuses on metacognition. How do we understand our decision making? What lives upstream of that moment of choice? I'm a certified systems thinking coach at Cornell Research Labs with Dr. Cabrera's folks. That's the focus. Can we understand that a little bit better? So I'll stop there.
You study decision making and you help explain decision making. What do you mean by, okay, well, I'm seeing the same problems when we're dealing with 2 actors or 1,500 actors. What do you mean? Bring it down a little bit closer to earth.
So let's take, I'm going to guess now, a bunch of the viewers of this podcast may be thinking about a choice to use lethal force because they're confronted with what they perceive as to be a lethal threat. How did you arrive at this understanding that's a lethal threat? What was your training? What was your belief system? What was the other things that were influencing you that day? Did it occur upstream? Did it occur in the moment? How about the person that's judging you? How can they know you and what you were thinking and how you viewed the world? They don't have the same eyes that you use. They don't have the same attentional focus. Now let's take it back up to 1,500 people. I have the same problem with 17 different reports coming in from, I was an intel analyst for many years. Which one do I believe? Where does it come from? Do I trust it? We're dealing with this with artificial intelligence right now. Is it hallucinating? Can a machine hallucinate? So all these things are circling back into what's referred to as the sense-making space. How do we think of that thing that occurs before the moment of choice, that shaped our moment of choice? And there's a huge amount of research, literature, and everything on this. And so I would argue, whether it's a viewer here watching and you're stuck in a one-on-one situation and trying to defend your life, or maybe you're someone you care about, or you're all the way in this group of all these interacting things, we usually start at an outcome and we call it these weird words like wrong or bad. Really? Whose?
Right. Or a legal term like justified.
Oh, yeah, there's one.
Yeah. So, why is explaining this type of stuff important to juries, for example? You're in a self-defense case, we have a shoot. The attorneys are certainly arguing good and bad in terms like that. But why is bringing an expert like you important to explain this type of stuff to the jury?
Yeah, so I view my role when I do the expert work as primarily as an educator. I've got an experiential background that's probably a little bit different than most. I've got an academic background, a little different than most. I have an employment background, a little different than most. So I bring these different experiences in there. And then I spend a lot of time interviewing clients or interviewing other stuff. So I get their perspective, which is where it all comes from. Now we have to help the jury get to their richest understanding. If we start from the outcome and we go backwards, we can get into a lot of problems. And think about how many times, and for you, Joe, you've heard the following opening statement, what this case is about. Mm-hmm. Oh, good news. You don't have to think, jury. I will tell you what you're supposed to listen to. What you're supposed to listen to. And through no fault of their own, they're like, okay, I know what I'm supposed to listen to. They're actually trying to do good. I know what to listen to. I begin to disregard things. And we usually start as, on this day and so was killed. Well, yeah, that's why you're here. You wouldn't have those charges, right? But all of that stuff occurred upstream of that. How the person understood where they're trained and how to shoot, what they were looking at, what they were trying to process, what was going through their mind. Here's an example of a case I just dealt with. Literally 1 or 2 days prior, this person had been involved in a very similar situation, had observed the same situation involving lethal force, stabbing, or etc. Do we not think that that's not going to influence how they then approach the next situation that occurs within 24 hours?
No doubt.
But if we were to look at reports or investigations, it doesn't have to be police reports or that. It could be private investigators. How far are you going to go upstream to figure out what might have influenced that act?
And there was a recent Supreme Court case that addressed this very issue. But before we get into that, just to kind of put it in the terms, the legal terms that Joey and I speak, what a defendant knows at the time that they act is relevant. It's highly relevant. If they had an experience that was similar, if there was a threat made to them, maybe by the same person that they're defending against, that can shape their experience. So there's a good example. There's a good high-profile example of this that you were actually involved in because you testified at the Kyle Rittenhouse case for the defense. And I remember when we're talking about when there was like media coverage about the alleged victims in that case, the people who were shot by Kyle Rittenhouse, several of them had nasty backgrounds, violent backgrounds, maybe even some pedophilic backgrounds, some really bad stuff in their history. And Marc and I did our podcast analysis of it, and we had to explain to people all that stuff, if Kyle Rittenhouse doesn't know about it, is completely irrelevant to the analysis of whether or not he acted reasonably at the time. The only thing that's important there is what Rittenhouse is directly aware of. Now, one of the guys, for example, was lighting things on fire, lighting a dumpster or porta potties on fire, and Rittenhouse actually saw that with his eyes, and that went into his analysis of how dangerous and how imminent is the threat that I'm facing. But had Rittenhouse been looking the other way and hadn't seen any of that, it's actually completely irrelevant to the analysis of his reasonableness.
Oh, no, I completely agree with you. And you're bringing up a lot of good points. We, as the observers of the trial, we as the observers of the video that showed the dumpster fire, literally.
It's a good description of the case.
Yeah. As we look at that, are we asking ourselves the internal dialogue of, but could Rittenhouse see that? Now let's just take it one step further. Even if he did, what meaning did he give it to? Mm-hmm. Was it just chaos? Even if we know that he could have seen it, meaning let's just say his head was turned in that direction, or you get the infamous cell phone video after the fact or surveillance video that I was just working with Joey with yesterday, right? And we say, well, look, the camera saw it. Yeah, but did the person see it? Was there attentional focus at that point? Because you know how it turned out. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what we're looking for right now is that gun. Well, of course you're looking for the gun. You know that it's important. But what was that person looking at that day, that night, that whatever? And even if they were, well, you can see right now their head's in that direction. And then you see them take a step back. See, right there, they recognize what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Right there, they took a step back. It might have been from because they recognized, and you're seeing a behavior associated with fear.
Right, right.
Or it may be that he just tripped.
Yeah. And I think just coming up with hypotheticals.
Yeah.
Because, when the average person sees a dumpster fire or somebody creating a dumpster fire, the average reasonable person might associate that with violent behavior, erratic behavior. And just like in the hypothetical realm, let's say that the prosecution, to rebut that presumption of the subjective understanding of the dumpster fire, what meaning Rittenhouse attributed to it, the prosecutor pulls up some sort of a video or something like that showing Kyle Rittenhouse say, my opinion is when people light things on fire, it's more of a political protest. It can't be taken to mean, violence or something like that. Give some sort of context to it to try to argue that Rittenhouse didn't get a sense of fear from that subjective experience. That's interesting.
Oh, no, it absolutely is. And we'll take it one step further. Just because he may have thought that on that day, why do you believe he's thinking that on this day?
Right.
Right? That's an interesting thing. And so this, I think what you point out is one of the areas that I spend a lot of my time in is metacognition, which is thinking about our own thinking. And I think this is becoming even more critical with the advent of technology and a bunch of other things. But this idea of what am I looking at? How am I looking at it? What am I missing? What might someone else be seeing? So back to a dumpster fire as our evidentiary piece here. Maybe what I am seeing is, it's a dumpster fire. They're burning stuff down, but I'm far enough back. It's okay. Because you gave it meaning, you have another potential problem. What does it take for it to get outside of that meaning to say, crap, it's not what I thought it was? There's probably a higher level of stimulus to get you past that because you're not looking at it as completely novel. You gave it a label.
Mm-hmm.
Once you gave it that label, it takes more for you to step off of that label.
Everything that you see from then on out is going to go through that filter of confirmation bias.
You got it.
Can I ask you a little bit about that, Doctor? You had said something that really intrigued me because it made me think of the way that we look at evidence as attorneys sitting in our office or the way that we present it to jurors, where we look at it in a very rational way. We're going through it step by step. But you were talking about the way that we think, and we know from researchers and doctors like Kahneman that wrote the book Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. That's not the way that we think in real life.
Right.
And so that actually caused me to think about how do we convey that to a jury? While we're sitting here in a nice courtroom that's very safe, that's well lit, and we're walking through and we're saying, well, here's where he stepped back or here's where he pointed the firearm. We're walking through that in a very rational way.
Oh, absolutely.
In a sterile environment.
Right. And we're all safe and there's no threat triggers going off in our brains. Whereas when you're there in the video that we were looking at last night and it's night and you're being flanked and there's lights going on and there's movement, you're not thinking with your rational brain at that moment. You're thinking with what some people would call your evolutionary brain,
reptilian,
your
lizard
reptilian brain
yeah.
that says, hey, there's a threat, act on it. So how do we convey that to a jury and say that this is the way that any reasonable person is going to act in that way, even though you don't think that as you're sitting here in a nice, safe courtroom?
I think you hit the crux of the question, really, in the safety of the judge's chambers. So Graham v. Connor got it actually pretty good.
Let's talk about that case.
So the thing is, we think about this idea that up to that point, and this was primarily from a police perspective, was the fleeing felon rule under Tennessee Garner, don't do that. But as it came up through that, this idea of how are we gonna understand this concept if we decide to use lethal force? And the standard in there of objective reasonableness, which is a unique term, right? Mm-hmm. Objective, the facts that can be known or reasonably known by that person at that time. Reasonableness, a completely subjective understanding. So we have an objective, subjective, objective standard, right? It's said it's incapable of precise definition, but we can ask a bunch of questions about it. So questions became the tool. So how we understand that. So let's go to this. We often use the word thinking as, we'll call it the type 2 deliberative in this, and we weigh the options. We're rational beings, right? Let's call that deliberative. And most of the time we believe that deliberative will produce optimization, the best outcome, the best choice. One. The best is one. There isn't sort of best or two best, right? But let's go back to what happens in the real world. When we're confronted in a high arousal state, high stress, we think we're about to die. We're back to that intuitive, heuristic, below the level of awareness type of we're reactive, we're processing super quick, and we're going into reactive. What's the goal there? Is the goal to pick the best?
It's to survive.
Survival.
So let's call that, and all the literature will point the same way, we'll call that satisficing. It's good enough. I just need the good enough thing that's going to get me out of this.
But, I even think further about that. I've certainly seen clients reason themselves into a worse choice than if they had just gone with that survival instinct.
And you bring up a really good point. So when I lecture or teach on this, I say, okay, look, for the person doing the inquiry, the person thinking about this, lawyers and experts, I don't care, just people thinking about it, right? Start from 2 frames, and these will be helpful. And here's the cool thing. If you're wrong, who cares? You can always go harder later kind of stuff. The first frame, every decision made by a decision maker made sense to the time they made it, even if they don't know why.
Yeah.
Your job is to figure it out. Mm-hmm. That's step 1. Step 2, start from the perspective of, and this comes from a book called Friendly Fire by Snook. He was describing how he was tasked with the investigation of a friendly fire incident where an F-15 had shot down, in the U.S., had shot down 2 helicopters of transport of troops. And he realized, quote, in his words, and I'll paraphrase it, that quite quickly he had 2 choices on where to come from. Good people trying to make sense of a bad situation, muddle your way through, as they call it. John Flack, a very well-known and just amazing cognitive scientist, calls it muddling, just muddling through it, right? Professor Snowden, this idea of adjacent possibles, the next best thing, because that's the best you can do in a complex event. Mm-hmm. The second part of that frame is, if we have the first part is good people trying to make sense of a bad situation, a potential choice is bad people making poor decisions. If you start with that, that's very problematic. If you start with, I know why they were doing it, versus they may not even know why they did it. So now, in a long rambling answer to your question and getting back to your original, maybe they are unaware, but something in their background, something at that moment caused them to do it, even if it's below the level of awareness. And the only way you're going to do that is you have to talk to your clients.
But it might be something, and probably is, at least in part, something that they're not even aware of or capable to talk to you about. Like maybe there was some experience they had as a child. Maybe there was who knows how far back cognition goes. We don't have a great understanding of the brain. Could have been a traumatic experience they had as a 3-year-old that caused them to make that decision.
Oh, it's possible. And again, I'm not a neurocognitive scientist. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not going to weigh in on that. But the absence of something is sometimes just as valuable as the knowing of something. If you can determine, for example, they're experiencing things like auditory exclusion. They weren't hearing things quite right. They were having selective attention. They were focusing on this, but not on that. There'll be little breadcrumbs of indicators there. If you put all that together in the totality of the circumstances again, you realize at that stage they probably were overwhelmed. They probably can't explain to you why they did what they did, because they weren't, for lack of a better term, in type 2 deliberative rational type of stuff. We want to believe it was rational. Even they may want to believe it was rational and give you a reasoning behind it. Yeah. But you'll be able to find out a lot of times that that's just a desire that we wanted to be rational. There's no evidence that's saying this person was involved in this linear, rational, deliberative process. And making that aware to the jury, I think, is the responsibility.
You mentioned a really important term from our perspective when we're analyzing a case, and that is totality of the circumstances. This is a term of art. When you hear lawyers talk about this and experts talk about this, we're using a term that's commonly thrown around in the legal sphere. And there was a Supreme Court case you and I were discussing last night that, in my view, kind of redefines to some extent what we mean by the totality of the circumstances. You want to fill in our viewers about that interesting case?
Yeah, so the Barn v. Felix case that just came out of the Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS, and again, I'm not going to weigh in on legal opinion. I don't have
We can do that for you.
I was going to say, there's two JDs over here that can do that for me. But it was an interesting case because it really highlighted a very specific question, which is commonly paraphrased as the moment of threat doctrine versus the horizon greater than the moment of threat, right? So the moment of threat is that idea of, hey, we're involved in this. I've got two people squaring off this. This right here is the threat present? Is this or anything else? Commonly used, it needs to be understood. I'm not discounting any of that. I spent a lot of my time in that. But then there's this other thing about, but the totality of circumstances means there was stuff that led up to this, wasn't there? Well, yes, there was. Well, how far is that horizon? Mm-hmm. Is it what happened to you as a trauma for your 3-year-old, as you pointed out? Like, I don't know. I'm not going to explore that. Let's use a hypothetical situation where it was a person, we'll make it easy. It's a dark night. You come around a corner. Hey, give me your money. I back up. And even before I have time to say anything, I'm carrying concealed. A person draws a knife and begins to just charge at me, and I shoot him. Mm-hmm. Very simple, straight fact set, right? This idea of, because you know the outcome and you know what was doing, we can begin to go backwards and unpack that. Well, what would affect it about their ability to recognize that a knife charging at you, well, probably training, probably other stuff. So let's ask them, where did you learn about this? Okay, let's go back to about that gun that night. Were you using different types of sighting systems? Were you doing that? Did you even have a sight picture? Probably not. Yeah, maybe you're using a laser type of sighting system. So maybe you remember where the red dot was. Whatever it may be. How did you process distance? Have you processed distance before? Maybe you played sports. Maybe you're actually very good at kinetic understanding of approach rates or anything else. Maybe you played football. Maybe you've got some of that, and that's what it felt like. So what I would offer is a really interesting thing to do for exploration, and this comes from things like Lakoff's work with metaphors and specifically clean language interviewing, and I don't quite remember who the author was, but the book is called Clean Language Interviewing. Same reason why you guys aren't allowed to ask leading questions, but only in certain circumstances. Is there a way that you can begin to explore this, to understand all of those type of things, and then maybe there is a natural point that the horizon line is good enough?
Can I play around with your hypothetical a
little bit? I would be
bit?
Surprised if you don't.
I want to tweak it a little bit because in my view, just from a self-defense analysis, the analysis you gave, all one needs to know, all the defender needs to know is exactly what you described in order to act in valid self-defense. In other words, there's enough information in the moment of conflict and incident there that we could very successfully argue self-defense. Right. Let me tweak it a little bit so it's more dependent on the stuff that happens outside of the moment of incident. Let's take the hypothetical where you turn the corner and somebody, you see them for the first time and they're rapidly approaching you. They don't pull out a weapon. They don't say, give me your money, but they are rapidly approaching you. And let's say that they're wearing a red shirt, and let's say you pull out your firearm and then you shoot them at that point. If that's the totality of the circumstances, this is going to be a tough case for me and Joey because we have to argue why you just shot the unarmed person who was just walking up to you and everything like that. But let's say that same person, that defender, heard the day before that there is a knife-wielding, red shirt-wearing killer who has killed 3 people walking home from work in that area in the last 48 hours, and they're still at large. And some of the people reported that this guy will come up to you, and you won't see his knife until it's too late. He'll pull it out and shank you. Now we have something that has occurred subjectively in the mind of the defender that could be extremely relevant. And I think what this new Supreme Court case says is, look, we have to, courts are required to place substantial weight on the things, the subjective experiences that occur outside of the moment of the incident when assessing totality of the circumstances. Is that your reading of the case?
Yeah, that's definitely would be included in that. And staying with your thing, how could we understand the totality of circumstances if we didn't ask those questions, right? Take the same thing now back to you, and you gave Kyle Rittenhouse. If they didn't see it, how could we do it? If they did know that, it would make a difference. But if they knew it and discarded it, those are the conversations we need to be having to understand that investigation, right? How about something that you grew up in a certain area, and the brandishing of a weapon, if you grew up with gangs or lower economic or whatever it may be, this type of language, this posturing, this lowering of the shoulders, you know all of those, and we'll give it a technical term, we'll call them pre-attack indicators, but you just know that the only people that do that are guys that are willing to follow through with what they're about to do. Now, I know that viscerally, know it down to my bones, right? But if you were to just watch, let's just say now, your fact set, I had a camera out here, because there's cell phone cameras everywhere, and they don't get involved, they just record things, right? So let's just say that recorded it. I look at that and it's like, but they don't have anything in their hands, or not doing this, or not doing that. How could a person think that this person's a lethal threat? Now, that's not a bad question, because that's a good starting point. How could a person think that? Let's explore that. Versus a conclusionary statement. There's no way this guy was ever a lethal threat. Once you state that, we're no longer asking questions.
The prosecutor's opening statement is going to say, what this case is about, it's about shooting an unarmed man who just happened to be walking down the street.
All right.
Yeah. And your comment about the subjective experiences and then going back to clean interviewing is something that I think we really have to be careful about as the practitioners. I remember a case years ago where there were a number of us attorneys involved in a case, and we were interviewing a very nice lady about something she had observed, and obviously how well she could see it was such a big deal. And at one point, one of us had asked, well, how far away were you when you saw this? Yeah. And she said, I was about 100 yards. And we all looked at each other. And one of the attorneys says, well, ma'am, that's about the length of a football field. And as we sat there, it was very apparent to me she had never been on a football field, didn't know what that looked like. And so one of us was finally smart enough to ask, well, ma'am, how long is 100 yards? And she looked around the room that we were in. She said, well, it's about from here to that wall.
Perfect.
We were in a 20-foot room.
Right.
So, but that was bad interviewing, right? We were doing bad interviewing up to the point where somebody finally said, tell me what it is that your personal experience is with that issue. That's where you come back to your explanation about somebody who's been involved in combat or who's been involved in situations where people attack, and you see those pre-attack indicators, whereas other folks, they might just look at it and say, well, I didn't see anything whatsoever.
Wasn't a big deal.
Yeah. So that personal experience in that context, and again, going back to that Supreme Court case, to me, it feels like what they're really doing is, I don't know if I would call it expanding on it, but simply adding more information to what is a reasonable decision or what is a reasonable person in that time and in that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that expansion's probably the wrong term, just because we have always argued as defense attorneys these experiences that occur outside of that moment of incident. But I think the Supreme Court case kind of mandates consideration of those things. It says that they are relevant.
Yeah.
For years, we've had to deal with that on the other side, because that totality of the circumstances question is almost always directed toward a police officer making an arrest decision or making a search decision or making a decision to deploy force of some sort. I think we're finally expanding it out now to other folks, to defendants or to folks who are not police officers, to say, well, you do have to take in all of these facts, and it's not just the facts that are right there, but it's the facts that that person brings with them. We talk about that with police officers and their training in the academy. Why would a police officer shoot somebody in the center of mass as opposed to the leg?
Right.
That's the training in the academy. You shoot them in the leg, you're violating your training, right? And so I think those are the concepts that we need to bring to these types of cases.
And I think both of you guys have hit on it very cleanly. And I would say that the case is really, if I had to take the one big takeaway, and you already pointed out, how could you ever begin to understand the totality of the circumstances if the horizon moment of threat is so limiting that everything we just talked about is no longer considered?
Yes.
This is let's call it a dance. We'll think in Aikido, Remi, Nage, and Uke. The fact is, it's a system. You're joined in this moment of lethal threat and lethal response, right? It's a dance. And I don't mean in any way to diminish it. I'm just saying this cannot exist as anything other than a system. You are connected in some way, shape, or form. Perception, threat, this, victim, whatever it may be. If we're going to understand that, we have to understand that both sides of this equation are bringing things with them, and both sides of this equation are creating things that the other side's attending to and responding to. Well, how are you exploring those? Because your attention is probably taught to you. You focus your attention on that which you consider important. Mm-hmm. Which also means that you don't focus your attention on that which is not important. How come they didn't see this? Probably because it wasn't important to them at the moment. They were trying to survive your earlier term. When you start putting all that together, and we're not asking, I'm not an advocate. You guys are advocates. You're the zealous advocate by the canon of your ethics for your clients. Rightfully so. I explained earlier in the introduction, it's about education, right? There is an understandable reason that is beyond just willful deception or this or that. They weren't paying attention to it because it wasn't important. It isn't because they're bad, they're good, they're lying or anything else. It's simply because as a human, it's within the limits of your human performance. I was having an interesting conversation with someone else earlier today, and one of the interesting things that I'm beginning to see happen in these cases, citizen, cop, citizen, whatever, is because of our desire to have less violence, our desire to have a more palatable outcome, a less tragic outcome, because we're all in the courtroom because there's a tragedy. Someone has either been injured or lost life or something. Is we place this desire of tactics or this or the would-haves, could-haves, should-haves literally beyond the capability of human performance. Mm-hmm. They should have seen. Even an Olympic athlete will miss things. And trust me, we're probably not training as much as an Olympic athlete. And the short answer is because we're not Olympic athletes.
Yeah. I think part of this comes down to, I don't know if I want to call it the myth, but the idea that people can multitask successfully. I think there's been a lot of research, you probably know this much better than we do, about how when people try to multitask, you don't do anything well. You just do a lot of things poorly. And really, as animals, as humans, we can really have primary focus on one thing. I mean, your eye can only focus on one thing, and then everything else is peripheral. Right. And then you throw in adrenaline and you start getting that tunnel vision, which I think is your body's way of saying, focus on this, focus on the threat. So I think, that's a really good point that you make, that we've got to be able to explain these things to people, and not just psychologically, but physiologically what's going on with them.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about it is stories are, you had this conversation last night at dinner, stories are wonderful ways to remind people of things they already know. So not that Arizona has a lot of black ice, but for those people that are watching that live in places that get black ice or anything else, many of you will have been in a situation driving, usually at night, because that's when it always happens, when all of a sudden you realize your car is no longer headed in the direction you intended it. And you're like, this is special. And then you think, you know what? I have 3 potential courses of action. I should be doing. No, you don't.
No.
No, you don't. Now, if you've been trained not to hammer the brakes because you grew up in that neck of the woods, hopefully you don't hammer the brakes, right? But eventually, hopefully you grab traction, you come out of it. Now, imagine right now that there was a camera, dash cam, and it tracked a car going past you with 3 individuals in it. That is absolutely true. That car passed you during this. They got out. They're very nice people. They checked on you. Can you tell me before they walked up to you what all of them were wearing? Because it's not important to you. Mm-hmm. You probably can't even tell me where your hands were on the steering wheel. Mm-hmm. You probably can't tell me the pressure that you applied to the brake or didn't. You probably can't tell me what passed through your field of view. We all know what happens in high-stress situations. Now, back to multitasking. If things are occurring that we have been trained in to really function, and like if I was on door kicking teams for a lot of years, it became what we call second nature. It's referred to as automaticity. If you do that, you can have a couple things going on and do them well. But once you're confronted with something novel that is not in your normal wheelhouse, that's our focus. That's our focus, because we don't have a blueprint. It's what we refer to as a mental blueprint, a schema. We don't have a mental map to get through that. It's a first for us. So for all the people that have trained in concealed carry and we throw our certain thing, we carry weights and everything else, I'm pretty sure you probably aren't allowed, depending on the state you're in, to train with live targets and live ammos to see if it works. Mm-hmm. So how do you know if it works? Does the guy fall down like in the movies? How was your decision for the second shot, the third shot? What's your decision process that you didn't fire the fourth shot? Because I'm just as curious about that as a stimulus response as I am on why you fired the first one. Mm-hmm. It's why you stopped firing. Because I'm guessing these are the questions that come up in the courtroom.
You know, another very interesting thing that I have found is how after the fact, so after something has happened, sometimes people can recall things and recite them very accurately. Mm-hmm. Other times they're way off. But even then, there's times when people have gaps and your mind naturally tries to fill those in. Andy and I were just up in Portland. We were interviewing a client in a very successful case. And he said something that really stuck with me. This was an armed security guard who was in a situation where he had to shoot and kill an individual. Okay. And this individual had come through a preschool parking lot twice. And we know the end of the story. We know this was a person who was unfortunately very unstable, very angry, attacked him, almost killed him, and he had to defend himself in the school. But he said something to us. He said the car came through the first time, and something just wasn't right. He never saw the driver. He didn't get the make or the model or the license plate, but something wasn't right. And he said, I knew he was going to come back. And he did. And of course, this security guard didn't know anything like that at all, but something had happened that he was observing. And even after the fact, he still couldn't tell us what it was. He just knew something was off and that vehicle was going to come back. And so he was already on alert. So I just find that interesting that people, sometimes you know something and after the fact, you still don't even know how you know it.
Yeah. So the human organism is a really amazing thing when you think about it, survival or otherwise, right? There's an interesting book out called Blink, and it talks about a lot of what you talk about. I remember one story out of it that's just really interesting. And so in this case, a fire crew was responding to a residence fire, and they go in. And then within like a minute, the lead says, "We're out of here. Go. Everybody get out." And literally just as soon as they get out, the floor collapses underneath them where they were standing, and all of them would have been burned alive. And so they begin to unpack that. And he's like, "I don't really know." Well, let's ask some questions about it. What do you remember about it? It was too quiet. What do you mean? It just didn't sound like the way it was supposed to. Experiential contextual knowledge, right? The heat was off. What do you mean? It was hot, but it shouldn't have been hot in the way it was hot. So the sound was off and everything else. What had happened was the fire was below them and it was running up the walls. So they could feel that the heat was different. But if it was burning where they were burning for that heat, there would have been a different type of noise. In that same way, like the hairs go up on the back of your neck, we're out of here, and they got it done just in time. Never underestimate the value, because your intuition is normally based on something that's relevant. Now, here's the downside of that. What happens if you train in such a way that you build in heuristic patterns that are actually flawed? Mm-hmm. Well, let's figure that out. What is the training you're doing? Let's figure out if that's occurring. That's why, again, back to the investigation, living upstream about, yes, it's a tragedy. We all know it's a tragedy. We're in the courtroom because of that. But the first job is to understand what happened. Because why would we ever judge somebody without making the absolute greatest intent on understanding?
Those descriptions that you just gave was he a fire chief or was he?
I think he was a crew. I forget the name of it. I'm not a fire guy, so I apologize for fire guys that are watching. I always stopped by your stations because you had the best places to sit and for me to take a relax when I'm in the cop car. And you're the guys that made sure that when we did something stupid that you could patch us up. So I applaud you. But if I remember correctly, it was basically, I think it was a truck that was responding, as they call it. And so you had basically a crew of about 5-ish or anything else. I don't remember if they had 2 engines there.
So
And
those
it was
descriptions that you just gave about what was off to him, he was able to articulate some empirical descriptions there. The temperature was off. The sound was off.
afterwards.
Right, afterwards. I
Right.
understand that. But to Joey's point, I'm actually surprised he was even able to articulate those things. It would have been just as believable to me to say, I don't know why I knew that we needed to get the heck out of there at that moment, but I just did. And so there might be subconscious empirical explanations
absolutely.
for why we're doing
And as a person that does both the investigation of these events, the inquiry, as I call it, because I teach inquiry, how we think about our thinking when we are inquiring, to do inquiry, is it's okay to answer that. The questions then become, well, what, and a good starting point is, to your point, maybe he doesn't know why. And maybe he will never know why, and that's absolutely fine. But let's ask a question about, what do you remember hearing, senses? What do you remember tasting, seeing, smelling, that? What do you remember for the pressure? Do you remember anything about your skin or galvanomic or haptic response? Whatever it is you do remember from a sensory input. Because here's the cool thing. You're the only guy that has that. That guy is the only one that can even begin to. And if he can't answer it, neither can anybody else.
We can speculate. I don't think I agree with. I don't think I agree with that.
Okay.
I think we could come up with empirical explanations of why he acted, even if we're not living in his experience. Like, for example, if he was trained to know that when the temperature is a certain way or the sound is a certain way, even if he doesn't understand that that's why he acted consciously, even though we're not in his brain, I think we could make some empirical predictions. Do you disagree?
I'm going to talk about that for a second, because I think what you were seeing in that situation was somebody who had a huge database of experience being in burning buildings.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is what it feels like.
Right.
Here's the problem for us, for our clients. I would say at least 99.9% of them are never going to be in more than one shooting.
Mm-hmm.
And so they don't have the ability to have that
They
experience
don't have the data
base,
set, right?
right? So they can't even verbalize the things that they saw or they felt, because until you've had some experience, being in that situation and being able to see what's important or what's not important, you don't even know what's going on. So I think from my perspective, that's what I'm seeing. But again,
I want to talk about the fascinating subject of flawed heuristics.
Okay.
Like, if you're running the wrong program, you're never going to get the right answer.
And
now we're into wrong and right. Are we really going to go down that road?
Can I throw an overlay on that with an issue on the heuristic? So what about if you have the right heuristics, but you're in the wrong situation?
Right.
And let me give you an example. So I have a younger family member who was over in the wars. He was over in Fallujah and some of the worst places. During the middle of that, as the military does at some point, they send him back home. Go home and have a little R&R. Like that's going to help. We're going to pull you out of a unbelievable live fire zone, send you home for a couple of days to see the family and see how that works out. This young man, I remember so well, his dad picked him up at the airport here in Phoenix and brought him over, and his dad was just devastated. He's like, we're driving down the road, and he's constantly twitching. He's like leaning, he's jumping, and he's like, son, what's wrong? And he said, Dad, there's cars coming by. And his dad said, well, of course there's cars coming by. We're driving down the road. And he said, Dad, you don't understand. He said, when we go somewhere, we're in a convoy. He said, and I'm up on the top of a Hummer with a 50 cal. And if there's a car coming towards us, we shoot it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if there's a car and it's parked on the side of the road, we shoot it. And if there's, something that I can't identify, a suitcase or something on the side of the road, we shoot it. He says, because everybody knows we're the Army, we're coming through in a convoy, and you don't approach us because you're going to get shot. And he's like, all I can think about is there's these cars coming at us, they're going to blow us up. Yeah. Now, he had the right heuristics, but he was in the wrong area.
Mm-hmm. And we've had that so many times. We actually had a recent case where we were defending a veteran, and his traumatic experiences, PTSD-related mental health issues from his time in service, through very traumatic things that he went through serving the country, caused him to act in a way that, as the prosecutor argued, a reasonable person in that situation wouldn't have acted. Well, this is where it's really important to know all those background things that the Supreme Court is talking about when they're talking about what's mandated to consider in a totality of the circumstances analysis. Yeah, it's true. Maybe a reasonable person would, but what about a reasonable veteran with PTSD who's been through this horrible trauma? And that was another good successful result for us because we explained the background. It's a lot to unpack there.
Oh, yeah. So as not to be rude to the people watching this, you see me scribbling over here. I'm trying to keep up with these guys because they have basically, in the words of Ronnie Dangerfield, I have one question in 29 parts. So let me try to unravel this to the degree I can. First of all, I did a lot. So I retired as a sergeant major, and a lot of times I would help people through their PTSD and everything else. It's one of the things that I did. Same story. It was actually next door at Gresham. Go out and visit the guy because he's been pulled over and everything else. Cops call me and everything else. What you're doing is fine for where you're at. You just can't do it here. Now, we'll use your terms, right heuristic, wrong time. Right heuristic, wrong. And what you're pointing out is the heuristic reasonableness as a standard has to be understood in its context. You cannot have the definition of reasonable exist outside of its contextual understanding. So we have to understand the context. We have to understand a reasonable person with similar circumstances and similar trainings respond to the same similar set of facts. Notice they do that in any of the reasonableness inquiries, right? So the question then is, how do we understand that? How do we address the context? Well, if you don't understand the totality, you're not going to get there. Going back to your first thing, I find it interesting in your language that you chose the words speculation and empirical together. And empirical speculation, that's an interesting choice of terms.
We do that all the time in science.
Well, and again, we call that argument, I think, but that's fine. But what I'm getting
right now, astronomers can take a look through a telescope and they can make an empirical speculation of what that galaxy is going to be like and what the properties of that star system are, without actually knowing it or confirming it.
Right. So you're making a prediction, a speculation based on the knowledge that we know at the time that is, for lack of a better term, proved by evidence.
Yeah. Like outside of that podcast studio door right there is no way empirically I can prove to you that there isn't a hippopotamus there.
Right.
But I can make a very well-educated speculation.
Which I completely agree with you.
About the empirical reality of what's behind that
door.
Right.
And I agree absolutely with that. But now let's go back to a use of force event, right? In these types of the decision making. I agree that this idea, and you were talking about the idea of having a large enough data set or something being novel the very first time, mm-hmm. right? But this idea that, well, you know what, the chances are that the reason that he did this was because of his training and everything else, back to the fire chief and everything else. And he gave meaning to that. Even if he doesn't know that he did that. Yeah, I would agree with that. The chances are. But this idea that it's you guys would have to figure this out, is that chance enough to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt? Is that chance enough? Whatever that means. Because all these things are graduations. All these things are gradients of moving up from beyond, reasonable belief all the way up to preponderance of the evidence and, all the way up to whatever. One of the very interesting things, and this circles back to an earlier part of the conversation that we're having, is this idea of truth. The empirical or Western science method has never, ever proven anything true. It's proven the likelihood of it being false is so remote, we'll consider it to be true for now. That's a very good perspective to take, even when doing inquiry to our evidence. You know what? The chances are that's probably the reason it came from. Yeah, but I will remain open that, in fact, it may not be. Mm-hmm. I will not say it proves that that was the only reason that could be occurring. And this is, to me, one of the coolest things. This is a choice that anybody listening to this can make. It's one of the only choices you can make, is you can choose your frames.
What you're talking about right now, I couldn't help but think about what we've been listening coming out of the federal government, particularly it's like organizations like the CDC, regarding scientific fact and truth, right? Mm-hmm. It is actually anti-scientific to say, this is the settled science. This is the science. You have to accept what we're saying because this is the science. It's what the science shows. the science.
Yeah.
And so, it's actually anti-scientific to make such a conclusion and claim that it's unfalsifiable. That's the point of the scientific method.
Well, yeah. I think it was, I forget how many years back now, but there's an association for everything. So there's I think it's the American Association of Statisticians, or basically it's the gurus in statistics. They came out with an article saying basically knock it off with this idea of the 95% 0.05 Cronbachs of statistical significance. You and I were having a conversation this morning about, so the lumens of the light goes out to 333 feet. The cell phone tower radiation goes out to 5,000. So at 5,001, there's nothing? I mean, at 135 feet, it magically disappears? What's happening to it? The fact is, the very nature of something being, for lack of a better term, 95% predictable that this is probably what's going on, also tells you that there's 5% of the time with almost at the same degree of certainty that it won't be. Mm-hmm. The trick then is in these type of things is maintaining an open mind. It's a mindset problem. Science has never said it. Our corruption or our misinterpretation of the scientific method is what gets us in trouble. The scientific method is fine. But for example, we have qualitative research, and we've had conversations about this.
Yes. Can you explain what qualitative and quantitative is?
Absolutely. So the easiest way to think about this is think of quantitative, hard numbers, regression analysis, this. You do a lot of population sampling, but just think of things like experiments, large data sets, numbers, and I'm just giving giant stereotypes. But if you did it right, if your methodology was sound, so for example, my first one I used was partial square structural equation modeling. That's a quantitative method. It does structural equations or path modeling, and I come up with an answer. If I selected my experimental population that I studied correctly, I did my sampling right, I can generalize this out further.
I think he just said he can speculate on empirical data.
Yes, that's what it sounded like to me.
Yes, I can. Yes, I would do empirical speculation, I think is a technical term for it, as Joey points out. But the interesting thing is, and the chances are, let's go back to the fire stuff. Chances are that this is what's going on. But how would we know? Could we do an experiment to prove that the fire captain knew that day about heat? Could we do an experiment to do that? Probably not. But you know what?
I don't know. I'm not sold on that. We couldn't.
I know. You're a quantitative guy after talking.
Because don't we do this all the time, though, with law enforcement, where we keep statistics of how law enforcement acts in different situations, and we can start to see recognizable patterns and trends such that we could actually predict something accurately.
But again, let's stay with that for a moment. You're speaking to high degrees of correlation, not causation.
Right. No, I'm with you there. I'll concede that point. Yeah. But to just say that there's no experiment we can run to see if this empirical stimuli is affecting their actions, I don't think I agree.
Okay, so the first thing is if you're going to run an experiment, chances are you'd run in a lab, and just the difference between clinical significance and lab significance or anything else already potentially creates a problem. But staying with your first question before we get down too many rabbit holes, but we can understand the population of a small group or anything else by their lived experience. Their phenomena. We have actually literally qualitative forms of that are designed to look at that. Phenomenology, phenomena, ethnography, a case study, reflective thematic analysis, whatever it may be. Here's the big difference in that. In the quantitative, we'll call it the quantitative domain, my job as the researcher is to remove myself and to be the outside observer. In the qualitative, I recognize the fact that I am going to be intertwined with the data. I swim with the data, so I have to be very careful about how much I influence it. But in doing so, it's a co-creation of understanding. In any given moment, for all those listening, if you're involved in something, the cool thing is you're entirely unique. Back to Andy's thing about how much we may be alike, and we may be very much, but we're also alike and unique. We are humans. We see the same ways. We have X amount of degrees of fovea vision. We have rods and cones. We do this for movement in light and dark. Yeah, that works. But I need to talk to Bob to figure out how that worked for him that night.
Sure.
So the merging of these truths, and this comes from what's called a four truths model, is a very good place to start, is we, as intellectual humility, getting rid of our arrogance, is we say, you know what, that objective stuff, that video and all the other stuff, let's do that, do really good analysis, put that over here. That's quantitative. Time, space, distance, we can measure it. How about the other stuff? I got to figure out what that guy's doing, what everybody is doing. I have multiple truths. I thought he was doing this. Well, I thought he was doing this. Well, I never saw this. Well, the guy says he was doing this. Let's just say that all of those are equally true. They may not have accuracy or be supported by the evidence, but let's just start out that they can coexist. Now you have the normative truth, the laws by which they're judged by, and then you have the complex truths when you put it all together. Just taking that as a frame of your analysis, you don't have to triage the truths. You don't have to say, this doesn't have to be, and you and I had this conversation, this isn't the eye doctors, better now, better now, better now, better now, where since it doesn't agree with the objective evidence, he must be lying, throw it out. I don't have to listen to it anymore. It's just inaccurate. And there may be a reason that it's inaccurate, right versus wrong heuristic, how I was trained. There may be a viable reason, and the only way you'll find that is through qualitative inquiry. There is no experiment that will find that for you.
I also think we're walking into it with our preconceived bias.
Yes.
So we just walked through this yesterday. You
Yes.
and I and Andy, we just walked through this yesterday.
Let's tell this story. We got to have Dr. Black help us out in real time to communicate a story,
Yep.
because that's what you are at the end of the day. That's what we are as attorneys. We're storytellers. We're trying
Great.
to tell stories. Now, a lot of times those stories are trying to be conveyed to a jury. This particular story needed to be conveyed to a prosecutor during a negotiation of a case. And so we got to see Dr. Black spring into action. Do you want to tell the story?
So we had a case, still have it, so we'll be careful what we're talking about. But in essence, a pivotal point in this case was a piece of video evidence. And in today's world, just it feels like every case now has video in it. And the problem with video is most people come in thinking, well, the video is going to show you what really happened. and we'll talk about that again on another case that you're working on, about how the video perspective and how your personal perspective can be very different. But this was a case where, at least in this situation, Andy and I are looking at the exact same piece of evidence that the prosecutor is, and we're seeing
two different things.
Completely different things. Looking at the same, I felt like we were in a, I don't know, like a
comedy sketch.
A comedy sketch or a baseball game where you're supporting one team, I'm the other, and he's clearly out, and you're saying he's clearly safe.
Right.
But it was, and in fairness to the prosecutor, this was a situation where he's walking in with a preconceived bias because he had said to law enforcement, look at this video, tell me what happened, be 100% sure that this is what happened. They told him this event that the defense attorneys are telling you is not there. And so we said, please look at the video. He looked at the video and he said, it's not there.
Yeah, I've looked at it. It's not there.
He literally told us that.
What the cop said is correct.
So Andy said...
And Joey and I are looking at it and we're like, are we looking at the same video?
Right. So Andy said, set up a call. Let's get him on the phone with us. Let's have all of us have the exact same video. We did that. He still didn't see it. Mm-hmm. So then we're walking through it. And now you've helped us sharpen this up to make sure that we're not crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about that because this is another field of expertise for you. Mm-hmm. You were able to very quickly and proficiently zoom up on the video, sharpen it, turn the contrast, turn the brightness, everything like that to really highlight the details that we needed worked out. And would you call that forensic editing, or how would you describe that?
Yeah, so I would actually stay away from the term editing, because what I'm trying to do there is I picked very specific types of what's referred to as interpolation. And in this case, it was bicubic, which allows a little bit of, we'll call it fusing of the edges. That's not the technical way you would call it, but it's good enough for now. And there's things like nearest neighbor and bilinear and other types of things. So my goal to help you guys out was I knew you needed to look at a certain area. And I also know that movement was a particular thing that you were trying to look for. So I know that, I can probably play a little bit with the light levels or the contrast. I know that's going to change reflection, but chances are if a hand or a leg is moving, it's not going to do anything in any way that's really drastic to that. I know I can slow it down so that our human eye can catch up to it. I can check it that the frame rate is a fixed frame rate, meaning that each frame is consistently occurring in a certain spacing. So that the human eye and remember, we don't see with our eyes. We take ones and zeros in from reflection and luminance values and everything else. But basically what we're doing is we give meaning. Our seeing occurs in the brain, right? So what can I do to make sure that I'm not potentially making that worse, that I'm potentially giving you flawed ways of what you may gravitate to? So I make sure the speed is consistent. I make sure this is that. And even if I slow it down, we walk through that about how much it's slowed, because I know you're looking specifically for movement. And so because of that, the only thing that was done was we made it a little bit bigger in a way that has the least amount of injecting. In fact, there was no additional information injected per se. There was gradient values that existed between things that already existed, which some people may call injecting it. We slowed it, but it's still the same thing. So I did not add anything to it. I did not subtract anything from it. I allowed you to focus on one area that had relevance to your case. And because of that, you were doing it. So
that's your trepidation with the term editing, is that to you that implies addition, subtraction, changing.
Cutting, changing, modifying.
You did more of an enhancement of the video for us.
Enhancement I'd be comfortable with, yeah.
But anyway, Joey, continuing with the story. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
So now we're walking through it second by second with this prosecutor and having to direct him to a very specific portion of the screen. And as we're sitting there, he literally says, "Oh my God, I see it." So
it was like the light bulb turned on over his head. And now, and also it was accompanied not only the visual aspects that we were showing him second by second, it was accompanied by a story. We were telling him our version of events as he was processing the visual stimuli, and it was like a light bulb turned on over his head.
Right? Yeah. Yep.
And what you guys are bringing out, and I think this is one of the things, and I'd offer this to the group listening or watching. Video is, I mean, think about it. The short answer is if you're a seeing type of individual, you're not blind or impaired, you're taking in the majority of your information about the world through visual input. Our brain is designed to do that. It also means that the ability for it to set us up is amazingly powerful. And so you're joking about this idea of, we're looking at the same thing. How can this happen, right? Think about some of the metaphors in our language. It's crystal clear. That's a seeing metaphor. Seeing is believing, is it?
Yeah.
The same people will say, the video clearly shows, are the same person that will travel down to Vegas and be tricked by a magician. I watch a monitor at a fixed focal distance from my eyes at 23 inches. And in that monitor, the bottom corner is depicting something that's close to the camera. Let's say it's 5 feet away. And in the far corner, there's something that's 50 yards away, which would be 40 feet, depending by your past model. But it's really 50 yards away, right? We know the human eye can't keep both of those in focus at one time. It just doesn't work that way. Now you're going to watch it and you see both of those in perfect clarity because of the camera algorithms. And you say, what's going on in that back corner? And then you zoom in. And then after you zoom in, you say, how come you didn't see that? Mm-hmm. That's the problem with video.
Another thing that I wanted to point out too is it's not just the prosecutor in this situation. After that case that you helped us on, you were helping me on another one. This is an active case. This is one where I've seen the video, and I've been doing this for over 30 years. And this is all I do is criminal defense. And I have no idea how many hundreds of hours of video, listened to recordings, looked at photographs, and we're going over this video yesterday that you've now taken and enhanced again. But also you're bringing to it not just, as the expert, you're not just bringing to it the ability to enhance the video, but your experience in use of force as we're trying to explain why somebody would act in a certain way. And your experience causes you to look at things differently and to register things differently, even though you and I are looking at exactly the same video, right? And you're pointing out to me, look, from frame to frame here's where this movement occurs, and then that's where that movement occurs.
Right.
And that was extraordinarily helpful to me as the expert. I told Andy, literally, I was driving home last night, and Andy and I were on the phone, and I said, Andy, I'm annoyed. I said, I'm annoyed. I've been doing this for 30 years. I guess I should know by now, you've got to get experts involved in these cases, because that's something, as I look at it, I'm like, I should have seen that. I should have pulled that up.
He was pissed off that you came along in 30 seconds and pointed out the thing that he should have noticed.
Right, something I should have noticed in the prior reviews of that video. And I've looked at it a lot.
But there's no shame in that, because everybody, like we've been talking about, one of the themes of this podcast has been the power of different subjective experiences and what confirmation biases we take when we're trying to process data. So this is why it's important to, just in every area of your life, not just in a criminal context, but in every area, understand your blind spots that you're bringing to the table.
Absolutely.
If you study complexity, this idea, and there's complexity theory and everything, and we're not going to go into this, but the idea that there are some things that are simply complex. You just don't know how they're going to turn out. You don't know why it happened the way it did. And by the time you figure it out, it seems to have changed on you. It's like, what the hell's going on here? Complex has that kind of feel to it. It's not ordered. It isn't like making a assembly line car or anything else. That's complicated, but we sort of know how to do it. Everything I know of in the literature says get multiple views looking at it. Plain and simple. And the thing is, one of the things that was done when they stood up this Santa Fe Institute for Complexity, I wonder if biology can help us understand banking. I wonder if banking can help us understand this. And the short answer is it absolutely can. Because that perspective, just having a conversation, created something that didn't occur. But here's the interesting part, and I applaud what you're doing for this. The time to have those conversations before we dug in our heels with our conclusions.
Yes.
The hardest thing to do is to maintain ourselves in the sense-making space, the moment before we come to a conclusion. There's an ad hoc idea of a critical thinker as one who can keep two opposing thoughts in their mind without coming to a conclusion. We don't like doing it. Our brain does not like doing that. It wants a label.
What's the adage I'm looking for right now to illustrate your point, which is it's harder to convince somebody that they've made a wrong decision than to convince them.
Right.
So
bring in the experts, bring in the other people. Hey, what do you think of this? In military, it used to be referred to as a Napoleonic corporal. Napoleon would give his op orders. The corporal couldn't understand it, go back and rewrite it. Right. In Connevin with Snowden, they would get an expert in the field, an expert in a related field, and a novice, because they would come together with something that is so much different than a single expert focusing on it.
How we handle this concept of, the more brains and eyeballs you can get looking at the same piece of evidence, the better. How we handle that within the AOR program is, in my opinion, the most important meeting of the week that we have is every single attorney gets together in the conference room and we go through the cases. We'll pull up the case and workshop it. Everybody's looking at the evidence. Everybody's looking at the witness testimony. Everybody's considering the case law, the relevant case law and statutory law. And we just kick around ideas. We synergize. To me, like having every single attorney and paralegal working on all of the cases, invaluable.
Right. I'm not a big fan of brainstorming. Honestly, I think it just does that because this idea that you're going to put something up on the board and there's no stupid things, then why is 5 people in the room rolling their eyes? Because it's participation ribbons. But there is a great process called question storming. It comes out of the Right Question Institute. Harper Kennedy does a bunch of other things. We don't defend our questions the same way, do we? But we defend our conclusions.
Right.
And then we have to have camps. We have to do other things. There's a sweet spot for figuring out novelty and something new is around 70 questions. When's the last time you asked 70 questions about anything? But if you can stay in the question space longer, get all those guys. What about this? Did anybody look at this? What about this or anything else? What do we think is going on here? So I built an intel team for one of the places I worked, and the standing rule was the first person that comes with a conclusion gets kicked out of the room. They freaking hated it. But man, we got some really cool stuff done. That doesn't mean you have to come to a conclusion at some point. Embrace the discomfort of not coming to a conclusion. Stay in the question space longer.
Yeah. And they're going to be coming up, whether they want to or not, the human brain's going to be coming up with conclusions. But I think the idea of this exercise is suppress that.
Suppress that.
And
Push
keep
it to the
asking,
side.
Keep asking.
And
Make
again,
it an inquisitive process.
Yeah, you got a bunch of alphas in the room and everything else, and they're going to start arm wrestling over who got to it quicker, who knows the questions.
So my producers are waving at me
Yes.
that we're almost out of time. But there is no way I'm going to let you off of this podcast without talking about AI. And I want to talk about a specific case of AI. So before we get into that,
Joey,
I'm shutting down.
he loves talking about AI.
Joey just thought, oh crap, I was so close. I thought we were going to get through it.
I want to talk about AI, and I'm digging in my heels with my confirmation bias. We're talking about AI. There was I guess, first of all, I'd like you to tell our viewers your experience with AI in terms of how you use it in your work. And
Oh, sure. So I did an MIT certification course on it, did that. I've been doing cognition with it. I've used it for years. I use it both in legal and other stuff. I'm also the director of the Center of Excellence for Public Safety and AI under IPSID, which is the Institute of Prevention of In-Custody Deaths. So I lecture on it, I teach it, I work with it, because to me, I see this linkage of the human and technology. You and I had a conversation at dinner, which has occurred across all time, whether it's writing, the printing press, computers, whatever it may be. We're always in an interaction, the human and technology, in the shaping of society. So we're in that wave now. So
as legal professionals, Joey and I are seeing more and more and more of AI creeping its way
absolutely.
into the courtroom, into the pretrial process, being utilized by attorneys in day-to-day stuff for everything from motion drafting to creating mitigation documents and reports. But there are some areas where I think it's crept in to a pretty disturbing degree. And one of them comes right here from Maricopa County at a recent high-profile sentencing. And maybe just to force Joey to be involved in this conversation, I'll make him tell the story.
This is one that would, in the words of the younger generation, would really trigger me. So we had a case here in Maricopa County that unfortunately involved a death. One person caused the death of another person. Case went to trial. Then the defendant was being sentenced by the judge. Okay. And the family members of the deceased victim came in and said, we want to put on a video, which is not uncommon, only this time the video was an AI-generated statement from the deceased.
Right.
Of course, this made national news. You've probably seen the video. It was the most disturbing thing that I've seen. I'm talking about from a legal perspective. Right. I was unbelievably disappointed that the judge allowed that in. And my response to Andy was, well, why not? Let's have a seance. Let's dim the lights. Let's have a seance and ask the spirits to tell us what the deceased victim would have to say. And again, I'm not in any way downplaying the fact that the family obviously had a huge loss. This person, was killed, unfortunately. He was convicted by a jury. I'm sure that's up on appeal. But this aspect of putting on something that was completely fake, it was just the most startling legal development I had ever seen, and it further increased my opposition to AI in the legal industry.
And the outcome was the judge said it had made a huge impact on the court's decision.
Yes.
And then ended up sentencing the defendant to a higher recommendation from the prosecutor or probation.
Yeah.
So clearly made an impact in the decision. And will certainly be an interesting source of a post-conviction relief petition, I'm guessing, that will be filed to try to get the thing resentenced.
Yeah, it's going up on direct appeal. So I anticipate, hopefully, the Court of Appeals here in Arizona straightening this issue out. But I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, so I can tell you what I do know of is that the American Bar Association, the ABA, and the National Association for Criminal Defense Lawyers, NACDL, are both working on this idea of AI. Now, it's interesting, opposed to AI. I remember someone saying, I'm now the destroyer of worlds.
Yeah.
Okay. In other words, we've encountered technology that has amazing potential to cause harm, the atomic bomb, right? But the fact is, at some point, the question is, can we trust the human to use it? And maybe we get to that point where we can't. But if they are already using it, maybe we can help them use it a little bit more ethically, responsibly. One of the credos that we work on, for example, in the stuff I work on for public safety, is the responsible adoption. What does that mean? You have out as I was working with Craig on your 6th bullet, we seek understanding and empathy. It's actually on your placard as I walk in. Can AI do that yet? So the fact is, what does it look like when we try to do this together responsibly? Because what you're citing for, and I completely agree with, is the irresponsible use of it.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, there will be some point, and this is what they refer to as the Pandora box problem, is there is something that is so potentially damaging that you won't be able to go back. Now, I don't know if we're there yet. I mean, I would argue we're probably not. But what I'm getting at is my concern is the operator of the tool.
Yes.
And a greater concern than that. So this, you and I were having this conversation last night. Become a better thinker. Seek to, you go to the gym every day, you do this or anything else, you do stuff, you read Blink or List so you can basically summarize a book in Cliff Notes. You have greater memory. You have this kind of stuff. You do these little quizzes so your memory doesn't. When's the last time you invested 30 minutes a day in making yourself a better thinker? Because that's going to be the differentiator with the use of AI. I don't care whether it's legal field or anything.
Let's do some thinking here about this high-profile example in Maricopa County, because there's a few really, I think, interesting issues going on. So the first is that the family of the deceased, a grieving family, are the authors of this AI abomination, maybe we can call it. But what does that mean? That means all of their bias, all of their confirmation biases, all of their subjective experiences and opinions are what's being reflected in the AI-generated deceased. But dubiously, it creates an illusion because you are looking at, I mean, the human brain can't help but draw judgments and make biases when you're looking at the deceased saying the words that were scripted for it by the grieving family.
It goes right back to Dr. Black's statement previously about how much of the communication that we do visually. Mm-hmm. And that's why, to me, that video was so perverse. It would be one thing for the family members to get up and say, well, this is how I think he would have felt. Okay, you can get up and give your opinion. But to put on something to say, this is what the deceased felt, and this is what he would say.
You're about to hear from him, from beyond the grave. He's going to tell you his opinion. Right. But just so people can wrap their head around the legality of this, when it comes to a sentencing, judges have much more leeway in terms of what they're allowed to consider. There's pretty much no limits to what a judge can consider at a sentencing. The judge can consider whatever the judge thinks is appropriate to consider. And if there's something that is objectionable to either party, you raise an objection and the judge will assess it. Now, the judge certainly was in his legal right to consider this video, but to give it weight is a different issue because you got to keep in mind, at a sentencing hearing, and Joey and I have done many cases involving a deceased victim, and the families come in, and it's an experience. Those sentencing hearings are very, very heavy. Oftentimes, the courtroom is packed with people who miss their relative, understandably, and it's a grieving experience. There's an amount of coping experience there is to walking up to the podium, crying, and expressing to the court what you think justice would look like in this case. And had the judge treated this AI-generated video as part of that coping experience and as part of basically, sympathetic to the family, they're going through a really tough thing, and it really helps them in terms of their closure to express this with this AI video, that would be one thing. But to give it legal weight as if it reflected what was actually being said by the deceased victim is a huge misstep that, to take a term that you used earlier in a different context, seems like a Pandora's box to me. If that's open up to the victims, it certainly should be open up to my client, to the defendant. Right. So why don't I make a video of maybe the deceased's father or something like that? Judge, this is, what I expect the family of the deceased. They're actually going to forgive. You're going to see this video. They're going to forgive my guy. Let me bring in I'll bring in Benjamin Franklin, by the way. This is, I've done some AI models, and this is what I predict Benjamin Franklin would say about my client's conduct. And you're going to see he's got some very good things to say about my client. There seems no limit. We could bring in AI Jesus to forgive him on the record.
And this is where, to me, I know in the legal profession, we often talk about a slippery slope, but we also talk about bright lines.
Right.
And to me, this is a bright line. There's no world in which that should be allowed. And I don't want to give the wrong impression. It's not that I am opposed to the computer programming. I'm opposed to the language that we use about it because it misleads us. When we call it artificial intelligence, no, it's a computer program. It's a bunch of ones and zeros. That's all it is. It doesn't have empathy. It doesn't have sympathy. It doesn't have foresight. I'm much more comfortable with the description of a large language model because really that's all it's doing. It's taking language and it's trying to predict what the next word is going to be based on all the words that it's read before.
Right. But let's take something that you guys deal with all the time, the value of something being pejorative or prejudicial, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's reverse the question on that. It's value, right? An impact statement or anything else. It can have many things you've already described. But how could we not see that and get to the point that we as a human could not be affected by it? And if you get to that point, the problem is, the argument is, we're not disagreeing that, and first of all, it's a message of the people that crafted the message. It's not a message of that. It's their belief or interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So we know it's not the message of that because that person is no longer alive to make that message. It may be the best people that knew him. It may be what he would have said, but there's no way to know that. But that's fine. But the idea now is when it's being given, that idea of can you come back from it? To your point, even the judge says, oh my goodness, that was impactful. Mm-hmm. It affected me. Maybe it should. Maybe it shouldn't. But we have to recognize that's the power of what those things can do. And if we throw the things out there as power unchecked or power not examined, that to me is, we're not thinking about it. Yes, they get to do something. We're dealing with the same stuff with the idea of China's already set up AI for judges. They're doing it in the U.S. with certain things like that. There is actually, I forget the bias for it. I want to say it's called automation bias. The human actually believes that a machine is more objective than a human.
Yes.
Wild.
We have that issue in trials all the time. It's the black box.
Yeah.
Right?
But where do you get the data from? That would be a human putting it in.
Right.
This in psychology, it's referred to as weird, Western-educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Because what they did is they did all their studies on that homogeneous type of population. Why do you think that population is representative of someone in a non-industrialized country or anything else? This is the problem. We take it black box. We think whatever's going on there, it's truth. It's somehow more objective. Maybe it might be mitigating some of the bias, but even us as humans, if I tell you, okay, have I told you about confirmation bias? You know what it is? So therefore you won't do it again, right?
I have hope that people will start to think. I think it's just too tempting right now because the technology is so novel that it's playing upon it. It's a very tempting illusion. But here's the reason why I have hope that society will start thinking more critically about this stuff and realizing that it's really the message of the programmers that you're getting, right?
Yes.
We've been talking like this since the beginning of human history about every concept. I remember the very first time we talked, John, you and I talked way too long about Socrates and Plato. And we spent a lot of time talking about certain Socratic dialogues and everything like that. But then, an important point to illustrate here is Socrates never wrote anything. Plato wrote everything. Plato gives us all the alleged Socratic dialogues.
This is my take on Socrates.
He's the programmer of Socrates. Insofar as we know anything about Socrates, it's from other Athenians that knew the guy. And so we've been doing this as human beings, expressing these types of really deep concepts for a long time. But the question is making yourself a better thinker such that you aren't tempted to assume what you're listening to and to be a bit more critical about where the source is.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting two key points that I'll sort of wrap up with this. In the upcoming, it's always been this way, but I think it's even more critical. I gave you the quote from Suzuki. Each of you is perfect, but everybody can use a little improvement, right? The very fact is, in fact, the two guardians outside of any temple in Japan are, it's the paradox of truth, because all truth is a paradoxical nature. Actually, that's a quote from Thoreau. Here's the thing. If that's the case, and we understand this, and we all agree with this, and we did, okay, so what is the things we need to do, whether it's inquiry for this stuff or anything else? One, awareness. Strive to be aware. Strive to be awake. Plain and simple. How do you do that? Feedback loops. Plain and simple. Awareness and observation, the journey part of it. If we're solution-centric, you're focusing on end state.
Can you explain what a feedback loop is?
Sure. So feedback loop is just what we're doing now. Hey, John, no, I can't agree with that. Well, then let's wrestle with it. That's a good thing. It causes me to think about it. Feedback loops. What's this society? But not only my myopic echo chambers of all the news feeds that feed us only what's comfortable to us. Go find some news feeds that you're uncomfortable with. Read those first. Then read what you think you already know is true. You'll actually change your priming mechanism. If you want to do something, how many times have you read an article where the headline is nothing that you thought it was by the time you get to the bottom of it, right?
Yeah.
It's getting worse.
Yes.
Way worse. Clickbait.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
If you find an article you like, start at the second paragraph from the bottom. Read that first, then go back and read the article.
Interesting.
Because that's usually around the time when they'll say, we'll give a little credence to the other side.
I want to run this experiment on my social media.
Play it with it and just play with it a little bit and just see if you begin to think about it differently. But the core, and this is I would offer to everybody out there, it is entirely within your domain to choose to think. It's one of the only choices you will ever have.
On that note, I can't think of a better way to wrap up this podcast. Awesome. Well, thank you guys very much for tuning in today with our guest, Dr. John Black. We thought it was a fascinating conversation. Really enjoyed having you in the office for the last couple of days and picking your brain and expertise on all these cases. So thank you for being on the podcast, my friend.
Pleasure was entirely mine. I thoroughly enjoyed all the stuff. Everything starts with a question. Question gets a conversation. That's how it always starts.
Yes, sir.
And the other thing, too, is keep doing what you guys are doing. Please.
We enjoy it too much to stop.
Yeah, you guys are too philosophical. I just want to open the damn box and put the cat out of its misery.
This has been attorneys Andy Marcantel and Joey Hamby from the Attorneys for Freedom Law Firm. Go and check out attorneysonretainer.us to learn all about our self-defense program and what it can do for you. Check out attorneysforfreedom.com to learn all about our law firm and how we defend people in the criminal justice system. If you like this video, make sure to leave a like down below, leave us a comment, share it with a friend, and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, this has been Andy Marcantel, Joey Hamby, and our new friend, Dr. John Black, signing out. Peace.
Peace.
Peace.